Behind me, believe it or not, is an apple tree. It's a crab apple tree, and it's being overtaken by all of the undergrowth that is growing up from the base and wrapping itself around the various branches. I'm always looking for projects that I can do that are simple, don't cost a lot of money, but can give me the best bang for my buck in trying to create good deer habitat, especially when it comes to hunting season. And here, it's the beginning of May in northern Pennsylvania, and it's getting to the point where it's too late to be able to do any pruning on fruit trees, to not set them back for the year. But there are still things that you can do to improve the apple trees and pear trees that are on your property. So I want to show you what I call opening up apple trees. You don't need a lot of fancy gear to be able to do this job in this project. I simply use a saw. You can use any kind of saw really. This is an arborist saw, but I also have a smaller folding saw that works well. I've got a pair of loppers. I like my little pruners that I've got. The more options that you have, probably the better off you are in getting into little tight spaces and the different types of wood, live or dead. But the bottom line is, if you have one of these things, you can accomplish this project. The first thing that I want to do on this specific tree is to analyze the apple tree itself and actually look at what's there. A lot of times on these old wild apple trees, there's multiple trunks that come straight out of the ground. A lot of times they have the same root, and so it's actually the same apple tree. But lots of times you actually have multiple apple trees growing literally within inches of each other. And if you're not familiar with the apples that they produce, my recommendation to you at this time of the year, when you don't actually see any apples, is to wait and leave everything that is apple tree related alone. Just let it there and pay attention to it this fall. Look at the apples that are produced and specifically pay attention to which apples and which apple trees the deer are most attracted to. There are certain apple trees, they'll pass 10 or 11 trees to get to one kind of apple tree because it's sweeter, or it has a certain texture or taste, something that they desire. If in doubt and you don't know what kind of apples it's actually producing, just let everything stand that is apple tree and cut out all the other stuff that is non-essential. Sun is absolutely essential if you want to produce quality and quantity fruit from your fruit trees on your property. And whenever you have other plants or trees that are competing with the fruit tree for sunlight and for the nutrients that come out of the soil, you're not getting your maximal yield. And this can become a really critical factor, especially if food is a primary thing that's needed on your property. There's not a lot of ag fields around. If you need some kind of quality food source late in the season, this property that I'm on is a phenomenal property for fruit trees. There are literally hundreds of apple trees, and this is great because none of them are named varieties. They're all wild apple trees that have stood the test of time, if you will. And they are unique in and of themselves. Some of them are small, some are very large, and everything in between. Some are yellow in color, others green, others are red. Lots and lots of different qualities, sweet, tart. Some start dropping in August, some hang on into January, even February. And so having this variety of apple trees is a real bonus for this property. It is a huge draw for the deer population, and it is the number one factor, I would argue, to be able to hunt this property effectively. So if you want to maximize these apple trees, get the most out of them that you can, you need to open them up to the sunlight and to the maximum amount of nutrients that can come out of the soil. And that means taking out the competition. At this point, you can see that there's already a radical change that's taken place around this apple tree. If we left things just like this by removing the competition, in this case it was mostly invasive honeysuckle, there were also some perennial weeds that were starting to grow up, also some buckthorn. Those are undesirable species here in comparison to the apple tree. And so by removing them, we've now opened up the tree to receiving the full amount of sunlight, and it's not competing with all of those other things that were growing for nutrients that are in the soil. You'll notice I've cut out quite a large pile of these competing vegetative forms that are trying to outdo this apple tree. When it comes to removing parts of the apple tree itself, this time of year you want to be really careful, because apple trees have this special ingrained growing mechanism that when they're pruned really heavily after they start growing, it sends a signal to the root base that there's a problem. And instead of producing fruit, it will send out new shoots to try to make up for what has been removed. But that's not to say that you can't remove some things. You have to be very selective though in what you can remove. The first and easiest to remove is anything that is completely dead. This doesn't harm the tree in any manner. If anything, it makes it much better, because insects often come into dead wood, and that will often harbor disease and other problems. This branch right here is dead all the way to the tip. And one of the nice things about pruning trees this time of year is you can see right above it here, this is a live branch. You notice the little buds that are starting to come out? There's none of that on this. So what I want to do is I want to cut this right at the collar. That is the spot where the branch meets the larger branch. And I want to keep these extra pieces separate from the honeysuckle and other things that I removed, because this may have disease in it, and I want to take it off from this site and actually burn it so that disease isn't disseminated throughout this apple tree. Again, you can probably see that this entire branch that connects all the way out here to this tip, and then it goes vertical all the way up into here, and there's part of it back here, and there's even a part that comes across here. It is bone dry and dead. I want to get rid of that because I actually see some disease on the outside. Now right here is where I can get into potentially live wood. And so I'm going to cut it right there and then gently remove it so that I don't bust up the buds of the living branches. Once we have all the dead parts of the apple tree removed, then we can move on to diseased branches. Now you have to be careful because most diseased branches, unless they're dead branches, can actually impact the tree if you cut them. So you want to be really careful that you don't take too much out. At the same time, disease can completely kill a tree. So it's important to be able to recognize what kind of disease the tree has. And this video is too short to be able to go into those details, but you can certainly Google it, and in the future I'll try to make a video on some of the top diseases, which ones you should be concerned about and which ones you can just say, I'll deal with that later during the dormant season. But there's no real diseased branches on this tree except for what I saw on the dead branches that I already removed. You can take away all this little growth that actually grows off of the root stems. They're called suckers, and they're just drawing energy away from the tree, and they're too small to be able to produce fruit. So I'm going to get rid of them right at the base of the soil. Likewise, I'm going to cut off any of these shoots that are usually vertical and have real fast growth, because they don't produce fruit and they rob the tree of energy. I want to get rid of all of these. One last thing that I can do to make my work stay as long as possible is to mulch this area with some wood mulch. This is not compost, it's not high octane nutrient stuff, it's just ground up wood chips. I grind it myself, and I also get wood chips from cutting tree crews. A lot of times you can just ask them and they'll give them to you for free because they have no place to dump them. So I'm going to put these around the tree. That'll keep the weeds at bay, and it'll also hold moisture in. There's also important fungi in here, mycorrhiza fungi, which are really important in the life processes of the tree being carried out in a healthy way. A couple of absolute musts if you're going to use bark mulch like this. Do not till it into the soil or work it into the soil in any way. You're just putting it on top and putting a layer of 3 to 6 inches deep of this bark mulch down. If you till it into the soil, the problem you're going to run into is it's going to rob all the nitrogen from the soil to break down the wood chips. And then you're going to have stunted fruit and production on your fruit tree. You also take note that I've kept the mulch away from the base of these trunks, because if I leave the wood bark up against those trees, they'll actually eat away, the bacteria will eat away at the wood and rot it, essentially girdling the tree, and you can end up with a dead tree. So I just keep a little pocket scooped out. I'm not going to do this today, but one thing that you can do to make this project even better is to put a complete fertilizer around the drip line of this tree. That's about how far out the mulch is, and that's how far the branches come out. That's called the drip line. When I say that though, I need to give you this caution. Make sure that whatever fertilizer that's called complete doesn't just include NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Those are the big three, and that they get all the attention, but there are like 40 different elements that are essential for things like apple trees to grow well. I've worked for 8 or 9 years on developing a natural, organic supplement that actually goes and feeds the tree completely. You especially want to steer away from high nitrogen fertilizers, as all that will do is create lots of new growth and very little fruiting. If you have questions, comment below in the video link, or you can contact me personally. Check out my website, seedstodreamsfarm.com, or check us out on Facebook, Seeds to Dreams Deer. I'd be honored if you liked this video, if you shared it, and if you subscribe to my channel, as I try to put out as much free content as I can regarding deer hunting, deer behavior, and managing your whitetail property. Take care. An important tip to remember, especially if you run into multiflora rose or honeysuckle that's in the vine form, or if it's especially a large honeysuckle bush, they will oftentimes grow up through the tree branches and wrap themselves around. So when you're removing them, it's really important to do so very gingerly and carefully. You don't want to break off fruiting spurs or buds. You don't want to break off branches that at this time of the year might be really vulnerable and flexible. Make sure that you remove them very gently. In fact, in some cases, the best thing may be to cut off the multiflora rose or the honeysuckle or whatever it is at the base, and then cut it off wherever it starts winding around the tree, and just take that lower section out. That'll give that vine time to die throughout this coming season. You can pull it out after the apples have dropped in the wintertime when you have cabin fever and don't know what else to do. The number one direction that you really want to pay attention to as far as competing vegetation is to the south, because that's where the sunlight comes from during the fruit producing time of the year. So make sure that that area is especially cleared out. In this case, it's the direction of the tree that's on the far side of the tree from where the camera has been. And so I have to make sure that that area is really cleaned out. A tree like this can take maybe 15 minutes to do. But once you have it done, this tree is so much better than what it was before. It'll produce better and more nutritious fruit, be more attractive to deer. It'll keep the weeds down, and the mulch there will keep that in check. With perennial weeds or perennial shrubs like honeysuckle and multiflora rose, you'll oftentimes have to cut it 2 times a year, usually in the spring and late summer, for 3 years to kill it without using any chemicals. But it's basically a war of attrition. You just keep wearing down its reserves until it can't survive. And then you have an open area like this where the apple tree is not competing with anything. I mentioned removing those small scraggly shoots that come off the roots at the bottom. The only time that I wouldn't do that is if the tree is so small, it's just in the first couple of years of its life, that a deer might be able to come in there and really do a lot of damage to it, a buck rubbing on it in the fall. In this case, it's pretty well established. It's certainly small enough for a deer to rub, but they've got lots of other options around here, and I'm not so worried that they'll kill this tree even if they do rub on it. You'll notice here that I removed pretty much everything except for the apple tree. There's a couple of them. And over here, there's a hawthorn. A hawthorn is one of those species, at least for me, that's kind of an in-between species. It's desirable, but the apple tree is more important. So what I'm going to do is on another day, I'm going to come out and dig that out and move it to a spot that it's not in competition with an apple tree. It can make great bedding cover for deer, and it also has some food appeal, although not near the level that a regular apple tree would have. And so I want to save that, and since it's established itself that tall, it's probably 7 or 8 feet tall at this point, I'm going to save it and transplant it into another spot on this property.